Okay, this is a strange one to me, but recent surveys suggested anywhere between 22 to 40% of adults now don't believe that Jesus even existed. Now, this is one of those examples of people just believing something by osmosis without personally investigating it. Because if they did, they discover that there isn't a serious historian in the world who doubts that Jesus existed. It's just not even up for debate in scholarly circles. In fact, I'm going to play you a clip of an atheist interviewing an agnostic historian called Bart Ehrman. So in this clip, the interviewer is trying to cast doubt on the idea that Jesus existed, and this is what happens.
Javi's asking, do you believe in the historical Jesus? That's a good question.
Yeah, I was thinking about writing a book about this because I get the question a lot, and I unfortunately get quoted as someone who thinks that Jesus didn't exist, which I think is really very strange because I've written an entire book on what Jesus said and did.
Okay.
and for him to say and do anything, he had to exist. So I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. There are a lot of people who want to write sensational books and make a lot of money who say Jesus didn't exist, but I don't know any serious scholar who doubts the existence of Jesus. We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period. So, I'm not saying this as a believer. I'm not a believer, but as a historian, I'm just saying that you can't just kind of dismiss it and say, well, we don't know. You have to look at the evidence. So there is hard evidence.
Why are historians so sure that Jesus existed? Why is there not even a shred or a scrap of doubt about it? Well, in this episode, we're going to divide it into two sections. Firstly, we're going to look at the evidence from outside the Bible. Then we're going to look at the evidence from inside the Bible. The first mention of Jesus outside of the Bible is by the 1st century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. In his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, he reported on the execution of James. And in that section, he calls James the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Now, Josephus wasn't a Christian, he didn't care for Jesus, but not only does he acknowledge that Jesus existed, he confirms that he was the brother of James, which is just what the Bible reported in Galatians 1:19. Next up, we have the Jewish Talmud, which was written by rabbis who actually hated Jesus. The Talmud has several passages about Jesus, all of them completely hostile. In this passage, for example, it says that Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray. Now, this is interesting because not only does the Talmud therefore confirm that Jesus existed, but it also confirms that he had a large following and worked miracles, although it attributes his power to sorcery rather than to God. In this passage over here, the Talmud also confirms that Jesus was executed at Passover, which again confirms the biblical account. So again, the Jewish rabbis hated Jesus. They didn't think he came from God. They thought he led Israel astray. They thought he was a sorcerer. But it was never in any doubt to them that Jesus did exist. Next up, we have the Roman historian Tacitus. Again, Tacitus hated Christianity, but he confirms that Jesus existed. After a fire broke out in Rome, Tacitus reported on how Emperor Nero had tried to pin the blame on the Christians. He says, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Chrestus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty, then upon their information an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. As you can tell from that passage, Tacitus hated Christianity, hated Christians, thought they were the scum of the earth. But he not only confirms that Jesus existed, he also confirms that Jesus was killed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and that his followers were persecuted and killed too. These are things reported in the Bible. The next mention of Jesus comes from a 1st century Syrian philosopher called Mara bar Serapion. I love that name. Mara bar Serapion writes to his son about how philosophers are always persecuted for their ideas. He says, "What benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. Or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras. In one moment their country was covered with sand. Or the Jews by murdering their wise king. After that their kingdom was abolished. God rightly avenged these men. The wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted. Marabar Serapion therefore not only confirms that Jesus existed, but he confirms that he was a wise and influential man who died for his beliefs. He confirms the Jewish leadership was somehow responsible for his death. And he confirms that Jesus' teachings lived on in his followers. These are all things described in the Bible. Next up we have the writings of Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor in Asia Minor. He wrote to the Emperor Trajan reporting on his dealings with the Christians. He says that I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted I ordered executed, for I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. So Pliny the Younger not only confirms that Jesus existed, but that Christians were worshipping Jesus as God right from the very beginning. It also confirms the persecution and behaviour of the church as described in the book of Acts. All of this stuff is reported in the Bible. Next up we have the Roman historian Suetonius, who also confirms that Jesus existed. He writes about how Claudius expelled Christians from Rome because of his influence. He writes, because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, that is Claudius, expelled them from the city. So this passage not only confirms that Jesus existed, but it also confirms that he was called Christ and was causing his followers to live radically different lives. These are things reported in the Bible. And then finally, let's talk about Lucian of Samosata. Lucian was a Greek satirist, and he said this: the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. So not only does Lucian confirm that Jesus existed here, he also confirms that Jesus was crucified, and he confirms the activities of the church as reported in the book of Acts. Although Lucian is being sarcastic about it, all of this is reported in the Bible. And we haven't even talked about Celsus, who confirms that Jesus was born in a village in Judea, confirms his father was a carpenter, confirms he had unusual powers, which again Celsus attributes to sorcery rather than God. We haven't talked about the writings of Thales or Phlegon either, who both confirm events around Jesus' crucifixion, like the sky going dark, for example. So when you put all of these accounts together, and remember, none of these people are Christians. Most of them are actually hostile to Christianity. They don't like Jesus, they don't like Christians, and yet they all acknowledge that Jesus did exist. And what they've also done in their writings, of course, is unwittingly confirm many of the things reported about Jesus in the Bible. I mean, if all the information that we had about Jesus just came from these secular sources, even if we didn't have the Bible, we would still know a good bit about Jesus' character and what he did. We know where he was born, where he lived, that he performed miracles, that he was crucified, when he was crucified, that he was worshipped as God from the very start, and we would know some of what he taught through the example of the early church. All this we would know just from the secular accounts. But of course, course, we do have the Bible, and that's the second reason we know that Jesus existed, because of what's written about him in the New Testament accounts. The New Testament reports were written by eyewitnesses who all lived at the time of Jesus and saw exactly what he did with their own eyes. Luke introduces his account by saying, "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honourable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything that you were taught." Now, having eyewitness accounts is very important because it means we have a direct link to the people who were actually there. These people knew Jesus personally. They knew his family. They heard what he said. They saw what he did with their own eyes. That makes their account the most compelling and most important of all. Now, skeptics say, well, how do you know for sure that those eyewitnesses actually did write these accounts in the Bible? Maybe Luke didn't write that gospel. Maybe Paul didn't write those letters. How do we know for sure? Here's another clip of that atheist interviewer trying to cast doubt on whether we can be sure these eyewitnesses really did write these books.
There is hard evidence, I think.
Okay. I would look for archaeological evidence as well.
For example, we have one author who actually knew Jesus' relatives and knew his disciples.
And who was that?
Paul.
How do we know that?
Because we have Paul's letters.
How do we know he didn't lie about it?
Why would he lie about it?
Well,
See, the point
but there are people. There are people. But
Paul says the cuff comments where he's not making a point, and see that's very important to historians. In other words, a historian wants to find disinterested comments.
Right.
And he says things, for example, about James, the brother of the Lord, which is just an off-the-cuff comment because everybody that he's writing to knows who he's talking about. So he just makes the off-the-cuff comment. That's very important information.
And that is, and that is if he wrote them.
Disciples. Now,
if he even wrote that
comment about the 12 disciples, if in fact, so the whole point is that you've got a disinterested comment from somebody who actually knew these people.
If he even wrote that, though, correct? Because isn't there some?
No, there's no doubt about Paul writing Galatians.
Are there some theories that suggest that maybe Paul himself had scribes that wrote for him?
Well, every person who wrote epistles in the ancient world dictated them to scribes.
Right. So how do we know then that?
Well, how do you know Cicero wrote his letters?
I don't. I'm not a historian, so I don't know much about Cicero. But
well, I am a historian. I'm telling you.
But there are some. but there are many historians who disagree with you, aren't they?
No, none that I've ever heard of.
Oh, really?
Well, not serious historians.
Not serious historians.
Listen, I know thousands of scholars of the ancient world, and I don't know any one of these scholars who doubts that Paul wrote Galatians.
Okay.
So these are people who've devoted their lives to this, and a lot of them are like me. It's not that I've got a personal investment in Paul. I mean, I'm not even a Christian.
Right.
I'm just saying, as a historian, there's no doubt Paul wrote Galatians.
There's just no doubt about the integrity of these books. But then atheists say, and he tried to do it in that interview actually, they say, well, maybe they lied. Maybe they just made up all of their accounts. But where do you even start with that? I mean, quite a common one is for skeptics to say that the early Christians made up the story of Jesus for power and control. Now, as we saw in the first half of this video, there was no power and control for being a Christian. Go back and listen to Tacitus or Pliny the Younger again. There was no power or control. There was false accusation, there was persecution, there was torture, there was execution. That's what there was if you identified as being a Christian. They were treated like the scum of the earth, these people. They were sawn in half. They were fed to wild animals. They were stoned to death. They were chased out of their homes. The idea of going up to someone being sawn in half or stoned to death and saying, I can see right through all of this, you're just doing it for power and control, is just ludicrous. And here's another thing. Every one of the disciples, except for one, were killed because of these testimonies. You would think that if it was a lie, then at least one of them would crack under the torture and say, okay, this isn't worth it, guys. I'm not getting crucified or beheaded for something I know is a lie. But that's not what happened. Instead, they all went to their deaths absolutely adamant that what they had seen, what they had reported, was absolutely true. They were so sure of it that they preferred to be tortured and stoned and crucified rather than renounce what they'd seen. That message in the Bible, those letters, those Gospels, we would rather die than renounce those reports. So did Jesus exist? He 100% existed. All serious historians agree on this. Whether they be agnostic historians, atheist historians, there's just no doubt that Jesus existed. And the question I want to leave with you then is this. Now that you know that Jesus existed, and understanding that by all standards he's the most influential person that's ever walked the face of the earth. I mean, he's so influential that we even measure time by when Jesus walked the earth. So that being the case, wouldn't it be a really good idea to actually investigate this person for yourself? I mean, find out what he said, what he did that so changed the course of human history. If you want to do that, it's actually very easy. All you have to do is go pick up a Bible, find the book of Matthew, then read forwards from there. If you don't want to buy a Bible, you can even read one for free by going to BibleGateway.com. I should say that there's a lot of versions on there, so if you're confused or are new to the Bible, then I recommend going to the NLT or the ESV version because they're very easy to read. And it just might be the most important thing that you ever do in your life.